Just a barista? At the party my stepfather sneered as my husband served drinks. Then the bank manager rushed in. We can't process the loan without the senior loan officer's approval. My husband set down his tray and pulled out his badge. That would be me. Cue the sweet sound of stepdad's champagne glass hitting the floor. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the room like a gunshot. Richard's expensive champagne flute lay in pieces at his feet, the amber liquid seeping into the pristine beige carpet of his showpiece living room. His face had turned an alarming shade of white, mouth hanging open as he stared at my husband. You. Richard choked out. You're the senior loan officer? I savored the moment, letting myself imagine this scene playing in slow motion. The glass slipping from his fingers, the shock replacing his usual smugness, the utter disbelief as Jaden calmly tucked his bank ID back into his pocket. 5 years of condescension crashing down in one perfect moment. But the journey to this satisfying crash began long before tonight's party. It started the first time Richard laid eyes on Jaden and decided, without knowing a single thing about him, that he wasn't good enough for his stepdaughter. He works at a coffee shop? Richard had asked that first night, eyebrows raised in practiced disdain across the dinner table. He didn't even bother lowering his voice. Natalie, darling, I thought you said he had ambition. I'd felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger. He does have ambition. The coffee shop is just... It's fine, Jaden had interrupted, squeezing my hand beneath the table. I love what I do at Benchmark Coffee. There's an art to creating the perfect espresso. I'd seen the slight tightening around Richard's eyes, the dismissive twitch of his lips. In that moment, Jaden became permanently labeled in Richard's mind, just a barista. Not a person with dreams, intelligence, or potential. Simply someone who made coffee for people Richard deemed important. My mother, Ellen, had given me an apologetic smile but said nothing to defend Jaden. This was her pattern since marrying Richard 3 years after Dad died. Smoothing over his rudeness, making excuses for his behavior, choosing peace at any cost. Richard's just protective of you, she'd whisper later. He wants what's best for your future. What's best for me is someone who treats me with respect and kindness, I'd fired back. Someone who makes me laugh and supports my choices. Jaden is that person. Mom had sighed, patting my hand. Just give Richard time to see that too. But time only deepened Richard's disapproval. When Jaden and I announced our engagement a year later, Richard had pulled me aside at the small family gathering. He'll never provide the life you deserve, he'd said, swirling his bourbon like he was imparting great wisdom. You're making a mistake, Natalie. The only mistake would be caring what you think, I'd replied, though my voice had trembled slightly. Part of me, the part still yearning for family harmony, had hoped Richard would eventually see Jaden's worth. Our wedding had been small but beautiful, held in a local garden with twinkling lights and just 50 guests. Richard had shown up late, complained about the heat and left before the cake cutting, making a point to tell several guests that he hoped the barista could at least afford a decent honeymoon. Jaden had taken it all in stride, his quiet dignity making Richard's pettiness seem all the more childish. He's your family, Jaden would remind me whenever I'd rage about Richard's behavior. I can handle his judgment if it means you get to keep your relationship with your mom. So we built our life together, a modest but happy existence in our starter home with our rescue dog Max. We maintained civil relations with Richard and Mom, joining them for occasional Sunday dinners and obligatory holiday gatherings. At each one, Richard would find some way to reference Jaden's job at the coffee shop, despite Jaden repeatedly mentioning he was also working at First National Bank. How's the coffee business? Richard would ask with feigned interest. Still making those fancy lattes? Business is good, Jaden would answer simply, never bothering to correct the deliberate misunderstanding. I'd urged him once to just tell Richard about his rapid promotions at the bank. Maybe he'd finally respect you if he knew. Jaden had shrugged. I don't need his respect. I have yours. Besides, he's never actually asked what else I do. He's not interested in the truth, just in feeling superior. When the phone rang last Tuesday evening, I'd had no idea it would set in motion the events leading to tonight's perfect moment of justice. I'd been cooking dinner, hands covered in breadcrumbs as I prepared chicken parmesan. Can you get that? I'd called to Jaden, who was setting the table. He'd picked up and I'd watched his expression shift from neutral to carefully controlled as he'd said, Hello, Richard. Pause. Yes, she's right here. I'd wiped my hands and taken the phone, already irritated. What is it, Richard? Natalie, I'm hosting an important business gathering this Saturday, he'd said, his voice tense. I need you to come help your mother. She's overwhelmed with the planning. Is everything okay? I'd asked, catching something unfamiliar in his tone. Not the usual confidence, but something closer to anxiety. Everything's fine, he'd snapped. Just some key investors and banking officials. Very important for the business. Your mother needs support. Jaden and I will both come, I'd said firmly. The silence had stretched long enough that I'd thought he might have hung up. Just you would be preferable, he'd finally said. This is a sophisticated event. My blood had boiled. Either we both come or neither of us does. Your choice. After another painful silence, he'd conceded. Fine. He can help tend bar if he wants to make himself useful. God knows we could use the extra hands. Just make sure he wears something appropriate. Not those hipster coffee shop clothes. I'd nearly hung up on him, but then Mom had come on the line, her voice pinched with worry. Please, Natalie. This party means everything to Richard right now. The business is facing challenges. He needs to impress these people. And so, against my better judgment, I'd agreed, not realizing I was setting the stage for Richard's champagne glass to hit the floor in what would become the most satisfying sound I'd ever heard. So your husband makes coffee for a living? The bank manager had asked me minutes earlier, watching Jaden efficiently mixing drinks behind the bar. Richard mentioned something about him being a barista? I'd smiled, years of practice keeping my expression pleasant while rage boiled beneath. Among other things, I'd replied, echoing Jaden's usual response. He's quite talented with beverages of all kinds. I had no idea the universe was about to deliver perfect justice, but looking back, I wouldn't change a single moment of those 5 years of silent judgment. They made the sound of that shattering glass all the sweeter. I had no idea then that Richard's sterling manufacturing wasn't the success story he'd always painted it to be. 4 years he'd boasted about his empire at every family gathering, the contracts with major retailers, the expansion into 3 states, the ever-growing workforce. His success had been his identity, the measuring stick by which he judged everyone else's worth, including Jaden's. The first hint that something was wrong came 3 weeks before the party. Mom called me at 11:30 p.m., her voice thin with worry. Natalie? Are you awake, honey? I'd been reading in bed while Jaden slept beside me. What's wrong, Mom? Is everything okay? Everything's fine, she said automatically, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. I needed someone to talk to. Richard's been at the office until midnight every night this week. When he comes home, he locks himself in his study with a bottle of scotch. Is the business in trouble? I asked directly. The silence stretched so long I thought we'd been disconnected. Mom. He doesn't know I'm calling you, she finally whispered. He'd be furious if he knew I was discussing this with anyone. But yes, there are difficulties. The Westport contract fell through. And the bank is asking questions about last quarter's numbers. My stomach tightened. How bad is it? He won't tell me exactly. But he's selling his boat. The significance wasn't lost on me. Richard's 38-foot cabin cruiser was his prized possession. The symbol of his success he loved to show off during summer gatherings. What can I do? I asked, though I wasn't sure what help I could offer. Nothing, dear. I shouldn't have bothered you. I just needed to hear a friendly voice. She paused. Actually, there is one thing. Richard's hosting a party for potential investors next month. It would mean a lot if you could come. Help me make everything perfect. He needs this to go well. That was the first mention of the party that would eventually lead to Richard's champagne glass shattering on the floor. Over the next 2 weeks, Mom called 4 more times, always late, always when Richard wasn't home. Each call revealed another crack in Richard's carefully constructed facade. The second mortgage they'd taken out on the house. The missed payroll that Richard had covered from their personal savings. The potential investors who kept backing out at the last minute. What happened? I asked during one call. Richard always made it sound like Sterling was practically printing money. Mom sighed heavily. It was for a while. But Richard made some gambles that didn't pay off. He invested heavily in a new production line for a contract that fell through. Then he tried to expand too quickly into the West Coast market without proper research. I wasn't entirely surprised. Richard had always been overconfident, dismissive of cautionary advice. The same qualities that made him demean Jaden's career choices had apparently infected his business decisions. The party's been moved up, Mom told me during her most recent call. It's this Saturday now. Richard says we can't wait any longer. First National Bank is reviewing his loan application, and he needs to impress their executives. I'd nearly choked on my tea. First National? That's where Jaden... I know, dear, Mom interrupted. That's partly why I'm calling. Richard doesn't know where Jaden works. He's never bothered to ask beyond that coffee shop. It might be awkward. Awkward was an understatement. Jaden had been with First National for 4 years, working his way up from entry-level to senior loan officer through dedication and night classes. He now oversaw all commercial lending for the region, which would include Richard's application. When I'd hung up with Mom, I turned to find Jaden standing in the kitchen doorway, concern etched on his face. "Your mom again?" he'd asked softly. I nodded, explaining Richard's financial troubles and the hastily arranged party. "He's applied to First National," I finished. "Your bank." Jaden's eyebrows rose slightly. "For how much?" Mom didn't say, but from the sound of it, enough to save the entire company. I bit my lip. "What should we do? Should we tell him you work there?" Jaden considered this, his expression thoughtful. "If we tell him now, he'll just find another bank. Or he'll try to use our connection improperly." He shook his head. "Better to let the application process work as it should. My team will evaluate it on its merits." "But the party's specifically to impress bank executives," I pointed out. "Executives like you." A small smile played at the corners of Jaden's mouth. "Well, then I should definitely attend, shouldn't I? Richard specifically suggested you could make yourself useful by tending bar," I reminded him, still annoyed by the condescension. To my surprise, Jaden nodded. "I'd be happy to. I still enjoy mixing drinks. Did 4 years of it to pay for college, remember?" I stared at him. "You'd actually serve drinks at Richard's party? After how he's treated you?" Jaden came over and took my hands in his. "Look, I don't care what Richard thinks of me. Never have. But I know you care about your mom, and she's clearly stressed about this whole situation." His selflessness made my throat tight. "You're a better person than I am. Besides," he added with a hint of mischief, "it might be interesting to see how Richard interacts with bank officials when he doesn't know who's who." The day before the party, I overheard Mom on the phone with Richard's assistant, Jennifer, frantically finalizing details. "The caterer needs final numbers by noon. Yes, the rental company is delivering the extra glassware at 4. Has Richard confirmed which executives from First National are attending?" Mom's voice grew more strained. "He hasn't. But Jennifer, the party is tomorrow." After she hung up, I brought her a cup of tea, noting the dark circles under her eyes. "Everything okay?" "Richard's being impossible," she admitted. "He won't delegate anything, but he's too busy putting out fires at the company to handle the party details. And he keeps changing the guest list." "Has he researched who he's meeting from the bank?" I asked carefully. Mom shook her head. "Jennifer says he keeps saying he'll review the background materials she prepared, but he hasn't touched them. He's flying completely blind." I thought about telling her then. About explaining that Jaden wasn't just a barista, that he was actually a decision-maker at the very bank Richard was courting. But something held me back. Perhaps it was years of watching Richard dismiss my husband without bothering to know him. Perhaps it was the knowledge that Richard had created this situation himself, through his own arrogance and carelessness. Or perhaps it was because I knew deep down that Richard needed a moment of reckoning, a chance to see beyond his prejudices and recognize the consequences of his assumptions. "Don't worry, Mom," I said instead, patting her hand. "Jaden and I will be there to help. Everything will work out exactly as it should." As we drove home, I glanced at Jaden. Richard hasn't even looked at the profiles of the bank executives who are coming tomorrow. Jaden nodded, unsurprised. "That tracks with what I've seen of his loan application. It's ambitious but sloppy. He's counting on charm and reputation rather than solid business planning." "Will his loan be approved?" I asked hesitantly. Jaden kept his eyes on the road. "That will depend on tomorrow's meeting. And whether Richard can demonstrate that he's learned from his mistakes." Little did I know just how educational tomorrow's party would be. For all of us. Saturday evening arrived with a nervous energy hanging over us. Jaden adjusted his tie in our bedroom mirror while I zipped up my navy blue cocktail dress. "You don't have to do this," I said, watching him smooth down the front of his charcoal suit, the same one he wore to important meetings at the bank. "We could still call and say we're sick." He met my eyes in the mirror. "And miss seeing Richard's face when he realizes who actually makes the decisions on his loan? Not a chance." His smile softened. "Besides, your mom needs the support." The drive to Richard and Mom's suburban Tudor-style home took 30 minutes. As we pulled into the circular driveway, I noticed several luxury cars already parked. German imports and high-end American sedans that spoke of the wealth Richard was trying to impress. "Looks like the regional manager drove in from Portland," Jaden commented, nodding toward a black Mercedes. "That's Curtis Wallace's car. He doesn't usually attend these events personally." My pulse quickened. Is that good or bad for Richard? "It means his loan application has caught serious attention," Jaden replied, his expression giving nothing away. Mom greeted us at the door, relief washing over her face. She wore an elegant emerald dress that couldn't quite disguise how much weight she'd lost recently. The stress of Richard's financial troubles had clearly taken its toll. "Thank goodness you're here," she whispered, hugging me tightly. "The caterers are running behind and Richard's already on his third scotch." Jaden touched her arm gently. "Where should I set up, Ellen?" Mom led us through the crowded living room to a corner where a temporary bar had been arranged on an antique sideboard. Crystal decanters of liquor gleamed under the chandelier light, alongside buckets of ice and trays of glassware. Richard wanted a proper bartender, but with everything else. Mom gestured vaguely. "I've got this," Jaden assured her. "Why don't you take Natalie around to say hello while I get organized?" As Jaden slipped behind the makeshift bar, seamlessly arranging bottles and preparing garnishes, Mom steered me toward a group where Richard stood holding court. He looked polished as always in his tailored suit, but I noticed a tightness around his eyes, the only visible sign of his desperation. "Ah, Natalie." Richard boomed with forced joviality when he saw us. "Gentlemen, my stepdaughter. Natalie, meet Bill Hoffman from West Coast Capital and Steve Grayson from Turner Investments." He introduced me to the investors with a proprietary arm around my shoulders, as though my presence somehow validated his worthiness. I smiled and shook hands, playing my assigned role of supportive family member while secretly watching Jaden from the corner of my eye. He was already mixing a martini with practiced ease, his movements confident and precise. "Your husband couldn't make it?" Bill Hoffman asked politely. Before I could answer, Richard jumped in. "Oh, he's here. That's him behind the bar. Natalie's husband is quite the cocktail enthusiast." His tone carried the slightest edge of condescension. "How thoughtful of him to help out," Steve Grayson commented, seeming genuinely impressed. Richard's smile tightened. "Yes, well, it's what he does. Mixes drinks. Shall we discuss that property development opportunity?" As Richard steered the conversation back to business, Mom squeezed my hand apologetically before being called away by a caterer with a question. I circulated through the room as expected, making small talk with Richard's business associates and their spouses, all while keeping an eye on the bar. Jaden had drawn a small crowd. His cocktails were exceptional, not just the standard gin and tonics or whiskey sours, but beautifully crafted concoctions that showcased his knowledge and creativity. I watched as he handed an older gentleman what appeared to be an old-fashioned with a twist of something unusual. "This is remarkable," the man exclaimed after taking a sip. "What's that subtle flavor?" "Cherry bark, vanilla bitters and a hint of smoked maple," Jaden explained. "It complements the bourbon without overwhelming it." The man nodded appreciatively. "You have a real talent. Do you work at one of those craft cocktail establishments downtown?" Richard suddenly materialized beside them, having noticed the admiration Jaden was receiving. "He's a barista actually. Makes coffee drinks at some hipster shop. We're lucky he could fill in tonight on short notice." "Just a barista?" Richard added with that familiar sneer, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "Natalie married down, but what can you do with daughters these days? They never listen to reason." The investor laughed uncomfortably, eyes darting between Richard and me. I maintained my smile, years of practice keeping my expression pleasant while rage boiled beneath. Jaden didn't miss a beat. "The coffee shop is a weekend hobby now," he said mildly, continuing to mix the next drink in line. I enjoy the creative aspect of beverage crafting. And what do you do during the week? The investor asked, genuinely curious. Before Jaden could answer, Richard cut in again. Who needs another drink? Bill, let me tell you about our projected earnings once this expansion goes through. Throughout the evening, Richard repeatedly found ways to emphasize Jaden's position, just serving drinks, while simultaneously preventing him from engaging in any meaningful conversation with the potential investors or banking officials who had begun to arrive. It was a carefully orchestrated dance of exclusion that I'd witnessed many times before at family functions, but tonight it seemed particularly calculated. What Richard didn't realize was that several of the bank representatives were greeting Jaden with subtle nods of recognition, even as they played along with the charade. One woman in a sleek pantsuit actually winked at him while accepting her gin and tonic. Your Moscow Mule is the best I've had, Jaden, another banker commented. Though not quite as impressive as that proposal you approved for the Adams project last month. Richard, standing nearby, assumed this was just friendly banter with the bartender. Yes, he does make a decent drink, he acknowledged grudgingly. Not much of a career path, though. I was about to finally say something, my patience worn dangerously thin, when the front door burst open. A flustered man in his 50s with thinning hair and a slightly rumpled suit rushed in, eyes scanning the room urgently. I recognized him immediately as Thomas Brennan, the branch manager from First National's main office. I apologize for the interruption, he announced to the room, slightly out of breath. There's an urgent situation with the Sterling Manufacturing loan application. We can't proceed without the senior loan officer's approval on the amended terms. Richard stepped forward, alarm briefly flickering across his face before he composed himself. Mr. Brennan, we weren't expecting you until later. Perhaps we could discuss this privately in my study? There's no time, Brennan insisted, still searching the room. The paperwork needs immediate attention if we want to move forward before markets open Monday. I need to find. His eyes landed on the bar area and widened with visible relief. Ah, there you are. Richard turned, following Brennan's gaze with confusion. The room fell into a curious hush as Brennan hurried toward the makeshift bar. Thank goodness, Brennan said, addressing Jaden directly. I've been trying to reach you for an hour. We can't process the Sterling loan without your signature on the revised terms. Jaden calmly set down the cocktail shaker he'd been using. He reached into his inner suit pocket and pulled out his bank ID badge. That would be me, he said quietly, the simple statement landing like a thunderclap in the silent room. That would be me, Jaden said quietly, the simple statement landing like a thunderclap in the silent room. 4-3 heartbeats, absolute stillness reigned. I watched comprehension dawn across faces throughout the room. First confusion, then surprise, and finally understanding. Several of Jaden's colleagues from the bank exchanged knowing glances, some barely suppressing smiles. Richard's face went through a more dramatic transformation. His expression shifted from irritation at the interruption to confusion as he looked between Brennan and Jaden. When his eyes landed on the bank ID badge in Jaden's hand, the one clearly displaying senior loan officer beneath Jaden's photograph, his face drained of color so rapidly I thought he might faint. I don't understand, Richard finally managed, his voice uncharacteristically small. He'd automatically reached for his champagne glass, gripping it like a lifeline. You're the barista. The entire room had gone quiet enough to hear a pin drop. Even the caterers had frozen in place, sensing the dramatic shift in atmosphere. Jaden stepped out from behind the bar, straightening his tie in a gesture I recognized from countless mornings before he left for the bank. When he spoke, his voice carried the same calm authority I'd heard him use during work calls, professional, measured, and utterly confident. I started as a barista while putting myself through school, Jaden explained, not just to Richard but to the entire room. I still work weekend mornings at Benchmark Coffee because I enjoy it and it keeps me grounded. But for the past 4 years I've been with First National Bank. I was promoted to Senior Loan Officer for Commercial Lending 18 months ago. He turned slightly toward Thomas Brennan. I've actually been reviewing the Sterling Manufacturing application this week. I was planning to discuss it with you on Monday, but it seems we need to address it now. Richard's mouth opened and closed without sound, like a fish suddenly finding itself on dry land. Several of the investors exchanged glances, reevaluating the dynamics they were witnessing. Mom pressed her fingers to her lips, her eyes wide with shock. "You're reviewing my loan?" Richard finally managed, his voice cracking slightly. Jaden nodded. "My team handles all commercial loans above $3 million in this region." The implications were sinking in for everyone in the room. The man Richard had been dismissing all evening, for years really as just a barista, would be making the decision on whether his company survived. One of the investment partners, Bill Hoffman I believe, couldn't suppress a short laugh. "Well, I'll be damned." The sound broke the spell momentarily. Conversations erupted in hushed tones around the edges of the room as guests processed this unexpected turn of events. I caught fragments. "Always assumed he was just serving drinks, and talk about embarrassing, and never judge a book by its cover." I remained rooted to my spot, a complex tsunami of emotions washing through me. Vindication certainly. After years of watching Richard belittle my husband, there was undeniable satisfaction in this moment. But also pride in how Jaden was handling himself. No gloating, no petty revenge, just quiet dignity. Richard finally found his voice again. "Why didn't you say something?" The question emerged as half accusation, half plea. "All these years." "You never asked," Jaden replied simply. "You decided who I was the first night we met. I mentioned working at the coffee shop, and that became the only thing you wanted to see." Mom stepped forward then, her hand reaching toward Richard in concern. I recognized the gesture, her instinct to smooth things over, to protect Richard from the consequences of his own actions. "Richard, perhaps you and Jaden should continue this in private," she suggested, glancing nervously at the onlooking guests. But Thomas Brennan, oblivious to the personal drama unfolding, pressed forward with his urgent business matter. "I hate to interrupt, but we really do need to address these amendments now if we want to move forward with the loan." The committee had some concerns about the collateral valuation and the projected revenue timeline. Richard's expression shifted between shock, embarrassment, and dawning fear. The reality was sinking in, not just that Jaden was more than just a barista, but that Jaden now held the fate of his company in his hands. "Yes, of course," Richard mumbled, gesturing vaguely toward his study. "We can use my office to discuss the—" Thomas nodded briskly and turned to Jaden. "Perfect. I brought the amended terms for your review. If you approve them, we can proceed with the funding on Monday as planned." As Jaden collected his suit jacket from behind the bar and prepared to follow Brennan, Richard seemed to suddenly grasp the full significance of the situation. The man he'd been publicly belittling was about to review the loan that could save or sink his entire business. "Jaden," Richard said, his voice now carrying an unfamiliar note, something close to pleading. "I hope you won't let personal feelings interfere with your professional judgment." The room collectively held its breath. Even those guests who hadn't fully grasped the backstory could feel the tension. This was the moment when Jaden could easily dismiss Richard with the same condescension he'd endured for years. He could make a cutting remark about karma or comeuppance. He could even hint at denying the loan out of personal spite. Instead, Jaden straightened to his full height, looking Richard directly in the eyes. "I've never allowed personal feelings to cloud my professional judgment, Richard. Every application receives a fair and thorough review based on its merits. That's how I've built my reputation at the bank." The simple statement carried more weight than any threat or insult could have. It highlighted the contrast between them, between Richard's petty judgments and Jaden's professional integrity. Curtis Wallace, the regional manager from Portland whose Mercedes I'd noticed earlier, approached our small group. "Jaden's one of our top lending officers," he told Richard, clapping Jaden on the shoulder. "You couldn't ask for a more thorough or fair review of your application." Richard nodded mechanically, still visibly processing everything. He raised his champagne glass to his lips, perhaps seeking liquid courage, but found it empty. As he lowered it, the full weight of the evening, the years of misjudgment, the public revelation, the precarious position his business now occupied, seemed to hit him all at once. The champagne flute slipped from his fingers. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the room like a gunshot. Richard's expensive champagne flute lay in pieces at his feet, the remaining drops of amber liquid seeping into the pristine beige carpet of his showpiece living room. My eyes met Jaden's across the room. In that moment of connection, I saw everything I loved about him. His patience, his dignity, his quiet strength. He'd never needed Richard's approval or respect. He'd always known his own worth. As Richard stared down at the shattered glass, a perfect metaphor for his shattered assumptions, I felt something unexpected alongside the satisfaction. A flicker of pity. Richard's judgments hadn't diminished Jaden. They had only diminished himself, closing him off from really knowing the remarkable man who had married his stepdaughter. Thomas Brennan cleared his throat. "Shall we review those documents now?" Jaden nodded, and the three men moved toward Richard's study, leaving behind a room buzzing with whispered conversations and Mom kneeling to clean up the broken glass. A lifetime habit of cleaning up after Richard's messes. I knelt beside her, gently taking the napkin from her trembling hands. "Let the caterers handle this, Mom. Come sit down for a minute." As I led her to a quiet corner, I wondered how this night would end, not just for Richard's loan application, but for all of us who had lived for years in the shadow of his judgments. Mom and I sat in silence for several minutes in the quiet corner of the living room, watching as the party awkwardly reassembled itself. The caterers efficiently swept up the broken glass while guests determinedly resumed conversations, pretending they hadn't just witnessed Richard's world turn upside down. The investment partners huddled together, occasionally glancing toward the closed door of Richard's study where Jaden, Brennan, and Richard had disappeared. "I had no idea," Mom finally whispered, twisting her wedding ring anxiously. "All these years Richard kept talking about Jaden as if he was just..." She trailed off, unable to finish. "That's because Richard never bothered to ask," I replied, unable to keep the edge from my voice. "He decided who Jaden was that first night and never changed his mind. Never even tried." Mom's eyes filled with tears. "I should have said something. Done something." I squeezed her hand. "We both know Richard doesn't listen when his mind is made up." Before Mom could respond, the study door opened. Thomas Brennan emerged first, followed by Curtis Wallace. They spoke briefly to a few other bank representatives before making their goodbyes and departing. The room buzzed with renewed speculation. Jaden and Richard remained in the study. 20 minutes passed. Some guests began to leave, sensing the party had effectively ended. Mom fluttered nervously between remaining groups, maintaining a brittle smile as she thanked them for coming. I stood near the study door, resisting the urge to press my ear against it. When it finally opened, Jaden appeared first. His expression was neutral, professional, his work face. Richard followed, looking simultaneously exhausted and alert, like a man who had been through an emotional ringer but had emerged with unexpected clarity. "Everything okay?" I asked Jaden quietly as he reached me. He nodded slightly. "We've had an honest conversation." Richard cleared his throat. "Natalie, could I speak with you for a moment? Privately." I hesitated, looking to Jaden, who gave me a reassuring nod. "I'll help your mom with the remaining guests," he said, squeezing my shoulder before moving toward the living room. Richard led me into the now empty study, closing the door. His usual commanding presence had diminished. He looked suddenly older, the lines around his eyes more pronounced in the lamplight. "Jaden explained the situation with my loan application," he began, pacing behind his desk. "It's not as strong as I believed." I remained silent, letting him continue without interruption. "He identified several critical flaws in my business plan that I hadn't considered." Richard ran a hand through his silver hair. "Flaws that would have been discovered eventually, probably after I'd taken on even more debt." "Is he denying the loan?" I asked. Richard shook his head. "He's recommending a modified approval with stricter oversight and a phased disbursement contingent on meeting specific milestones." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "It's actually better than I deserve." The admission was so unlike Richard that I stared at him, momentarily speechless. "I've been unfair to your husband," he continued, the words seeming to physically pain him. "I made assumptions about his character, his intelligence, his potential, all based on a job I deemed beneath me." "Yes, you did," I agreed, not making this easy for him. "For 5 years, you've belittled and dismissed him at every opportunity. You've made snide comments, ignored his accomplishments, and treated him like he was inferior, all without bothering to know the first thing about him." Richard winced. "I know." "No, I don't think you do," I pressed, years of bottled frustration finally finding release. "Do you have any idea how many family gatherings Jaden has endured for my sake? How many times he's swallowed his pride and accepted your condescension because he knew I wanted peace with Mom. He never needed your approval, Richard. He's always known his worth. But I needed you to see it and you refused to even try. To my shock, Richard's eyes glistened with moisture. In 5 years I'd never seen him display such vulnerability. I was wrong, he said simply. I've been wrong about many things. The straightforward admission stunned me into silence. Jaden didn't have to help me tonight, Richard continued, staring out the window at the dwindling collection of cars in the driveway. He could have denied my loan outright and been completely justified. Instead, he's giving me a chance to save my company, provided I'm willing to accept guidance and oversight. He turned back to me. Your husband is a better man than I am, Natalie. I see that now. The conversation with Richard left me emotionally drained but cautiously hopeful. When Jaden and I finally left that night, the last guests long gone, Richard shook Jaden's hand. It wasn't a warm embrace or a heartfelt apology. Richard had too much pride for that, but it was acknowledgement. A beginning. The weeks following the party brought subtle but significant changes. Richard's company entered the structured loan program that Jaden had recommended. Under the bank's guidance, Richard was forced to scale back his grandiose expansion plans and focus on stabilizing his core business. A bitter pill he might never have swallowed without the wake-up call of nearly losing everything. 3 weeks after the party, Richard called Jaden directly, not through me, to ask his opinion on a restructuring proposal. The conversation lasted nearly an hour. He actually listened, Jaden remarked afterward, genuine surprise in his voice. A month later we accepted an invitation to dinner at their house, something we'd usually approach with dread. The evening wasn't without tension, but Richard made a visible effort. He asked Jaden about his work at the bank. He even expressed interest in specialty coffee, admitting he knew nothing about the different brewing methods Jaden had mastered. Maybe you could show me sometime, Richard suggested as we were leaving. The offer was awkward, hesitant, but sincere. Over the following months, a new relationship slowly emerged from the ashes of the old. Not friendship, there was too much history for that, but something approaching mutual respect. Richard stopped introducing Jaden as Natalie's husband, and started using his name. He began consulting Jaden on financial matters, acknowledging his expertise. Most significantly, he stopped making snide comments about Jaden's weekend job at the coffee shop. 6 months after the party, when Sterling Manufacturing met its first major milestone under the loan program, Richard invited us to a small celebration dinner. I wouldn't be here without Jaden's guidance, he admitted to the small gathering of employees and family. Sometimes the best advice comes from unexpected sources. It wasn't a full acknowledgement of his prejudice, but for Richard, it was progress. That night as Jaden and I drove home, I asked the question that had been on my mind for months. Do you think you'll ever forgive him completely? Jaden considered this, his face thoughtful in the dashboard light. Forgiveness isn't really the point, he finally said. What matters is that he's learning to see people for who they really are, not who he assumes them to be. That kind of growth is worth more than an apology. As we pulled into our driveway, he added, everyone deserves a chance to rebuild on honest ground. I leaned over and kissed him, overwhelmed yet again by the quiet wisdom that Richard had spent years overlooking. My husband had never been just a barista. He had always been extraordinary. Richard had simply refused to see it. And while the sound of that champagne glass shattering would always remain one of the most satisfying moments of my life, watching Richard slowly earn Jaden's respect was, in its own way, an even sweeter victory.